Okay, I've got a weird one. So I just finished another Murakami book. This one is Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. Now, of course, it's a weird one if it's a Murakami book, but I mean, it's just a weird one. So this one, the narrative there's two different narratives in two different worlds that take place sequentially, I guess you could say, maybe. Like one chapter is one narrative, the other chapter is the other narrative. And yeah, so we get one after the other, one after the other. One is the sort of hard-boiled Wonderland, and then the other is the end of the world. The first one is in the past tense, and the other one is in the present tense, if that means anything. So our main character is a Murakami protagonist. He could be the kind of the same as any of the other ones. He has the weird sort of passive thing that I saw in Kafka on the Shore, where like there's one scene where his apartment gets ransacked and destroyed by these people, and all the things he loved are destroyed, and he just sort of sits there and watches the whole thing. Even though previously to that he had like made sure he had his knife in his pocket, he still just doesn't do anything. He also loves jazz and loves reading obscure 19th century European literature and cooking. He'll cook like crazy, but he doesn't eat. And of course, every woman that he meets, he like internally comments on her sexually, but then is not really interested in her sexually. But then, of course, these women all are totally all over this character sexually. This book, I would say, is the most science fiction of Murakami's books. It still has magical realism elements to it, definitely, but it could almost be a science fiction novel. So our first narrative is this guy, like I said, the protagonist. There's no names in this book. The protagonist doesn't have a name. People are referred to as their like the colonel, the professor, the professor's granddaughter, who's called the chubby girl a lot, and it's just commented a lot on how large she is and how, of course, this makes the man attracted to her, even though she's chubby. Or the librarian. So anyways, this character, he is a calcultech, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. His job is data encryption. He does this, so this was published in like the late 80s, early 90s, late 80s, I think. And so really early computer era, but he translates data or encrypts data using some way where he can like separate his left side of his brain and his right side of his brain, and then sort of inputs the data into one side of the brain, scrambles it, and then it comes out the other side of his brain. He rewrites the data out by hand. And so that's his job as a calcultech. He works for something called the System, which is sort of this, it was a private corporation, but sort of took on government and state roles. And it's sort of like the, not Google, but it sort of controls all information and protects and encrypts and keeps safe information. The sort of antagonists in this world are things called the semiotics, who work for this entity called the Factory, that is sort of an underground mafia style thing where they're trying to steal data and sell it on the black market. So it's all info wars, which is kind of a loaded term, but info wars, war of information. And our main character works on the sort of the good guy side of it, although it's kind of hinted at the end of the book that maybe both these sides are run by the same sort of person or entity, and it's all sort of smoke and mirrors, and it's all a big game. Anyway, so he takes on a job by this professor to encrypt some data. And so he goes to their office, and the granddaughter meets him, and like I mentioned the granddaughter before. But in order to get to it, he has to go to a secret room that takes him down a tunnel, subterranean tunnel, that follows the subterranean river underneath Tokyo. And he finally gets to where the professor is. Now, the professor has this technology where he can eliminate sound. And now this bears no bearing on the plot, and it's just sort of a weird thing introduced in the first part of the book. Kind of weird and out of place. But he can sort of turn off sound. Not by using like other sound waves for noise canceling or whatever, but he can somehow mess with the mind or physics. I don't know. It's the magical realism part, but also kind of sci-fi. The other magical realism part is there are these creatures called inklings, which are like some sort of, I don't know, like Sahagin water demon, underground darkness nocturnal creatures that sort of exist. And they're sort of a threat We never actually see them, but they're sort of a weird background threat. Anyways, he gets to the lab of the professor. The professor says, great, I need you to launder this data, just to encrypt it with the left brain, right brain thing. But then I also want you to shuffle it. Now, shuffling is this sort of a one step up. It's an even more intense and secure level of encryption. Now, his company is sort of shut down shuffling for 3 months. No one's been allowed to do it, but for some reason he has the paperwork that says he can do it. So he's like, fine, I'll do it. Now, shuffling involves this sort of black box that's inside people's heads. Now, not literally, although I think there is some circuitry inside their heads, but it's training, and it is also the surgery that these Calcutechs, like our main character, have gone through, that they sort of have an extra subconscious that their conscious mind can't access. Like, you can't access your subconscious. And whatever that black box is, when he fires up a specific musical cue which tells his brain to get into that mode, and then he takes the data in, it goes into that subconscious, that extra subconscious black box thing he has, scrambles it, encrypts it in a certain way, and spits it out the other end. And to decrypt the data, he just does it in reverse. So he is sort of a biological encryption software, hardware. So he does this for the professor, and he says, like, I'll go home and do the shuffling. It'll take whatever, a few days. The professor gives him a hard deadline that he has to be back by. So he goes home, and the granddaughter gives him a box as a gift, a parting gift, on his way out. He gets home, opens the box, and finds it's this animal skull. Now, the professor had been working with skulls and had some sort of a theory that you could read memories from skulls, and that the skulls somehow retain the experiences of their former hosts. And anyways, it's the skull, and he eventually figures out it's a unicorn skull, which is weird. So he goes to the library and tries to get all the books possible on unicorns, and he meets this librarian who, again, is this other woman that, because he is a Murakami protagonist, she's just instantly, maybe not in love with, at least in lust with. So they sleep together various times, and they do sort of have a weird sort of relationship. The granddaughter also is in love with the main character, or again, lust. But she's 17 and also chubby, so I guess he's not interested. But he seems interested. It's Murakami, it's weird. Anyways, he gets the skull, and he's investigating it, but then he gets sort of the sense that he's being followed, so he takes the skull and he hides it somewhere. And then the semiotics, the sort of the bad guys, show up to his house, and they tear the place apart. And I'm not going to get into too many details, but his place is trashed, so he has to leave. So at this point, the granddaughter's trying to get a hold of him. She says her grandfather was attacked. He's sort of gone into hiding. They need help. And so the granddaughter and the protagonist go back through to the lab. The lab's been trashed, and they're like, grandfather's gone. Well, no, he actually went out the secret back way. So they go out the secret back way, and like I said, the Inklings are a threat, and it's a whole thing. But they get through this maze, and they get to the grandfather, and then he explains the whole thing. So it turns out that this professor is actually the guy who invented shuffling and the Calcutech technology and everything, and he has done this sort of this job. He's got the protagonist to do this job as an experiment. So it turns out the protagonist is the only one who's gone through the shuffling procedure and survived. Everyone else has died after a year or so, but he survived 3 years on, so they think he's special somehow. And the professor reveals that the protagonist has an extra world inside of his head, and that because of the way his brain is wired and the stuff that the professor's done to it, his consciousness is going to be sort of subsumed into that fake subconscious that the professor created and placed inside of his head. This place called the End of the World. And he describes this world as a town surrounded by a high wall, where there are these beasts there, these unicorns, hence the unicorn skull, and that the minds, no one inside this town has minds. They are mindless. Their minds are somehow tied to the beasts that sort of collect the ego and then die, and then it's passed on or whatever. And anyway, something has happened and messed up in this guy's head, and eventually he's going to go into this world. And once he's in there, he can't get out, but he will have a sort of immortality because while his sort of body will die and decay, his mind inside this subconscious will, not time dilation, but because of perception and senses, it will feel like he's living forever because he will live so long. Time inside of his head will be so much longer than time outside of his head. Yeah, it's weird. But because he's a passive guy, he sort of accepts it. He's like, there's nothing I can do, but I'm going to go back to the surface world because they're sort of in this underground cave this whole time. I'm going to go back to the surface world and sort of live my life, my last 24 hours out there. And so he manages to escape with the granddaughter. They go back to his apartment, which is still trashed. Actually, it's been cleaned up, I think, at this point by the librarian. And he eventually goes out with the librarian and spends sort of the last 24 hours with her. They go on a date and they spend the night. And he rents an expensive car and he buys an expensive outfit, and he goes to this park and sort of puts his feet up on the dash, leans back and falls asleep just as the sort of the timer's ticking over and sort of his time is up and his mind is going to be whatever. And that's the end. But that's the end of I'm not going to say end of half of the chapters. So while all of these chapters are taking place, we're also getting every other chapters of this town surrounded by this wall called the end of the world. This place inside of his subconscious that he's created artificially. And this is why what the professor's saying kind of makes sense about the unicorns and the whatnot, because we've already experienced that through these chapters. So in these chapters, we have a protagonist, which we find out is the same guy, and it's sort of assumed, who is in this town. He arrives at this town, and when he arrives there, he's told by the gatekeeper that he can't keep his shadow. So his shadow is cut off, literally, physically cut off from him, and kept separate from him, and he's not allowed contact with his shadow. It's revealed later that his shadow is sort of his mind. No one in this town has shadows because they don't have minds. And eventually, if he's separated from his shadow for long enough, the shadow will die, and at that point, his mind will die, and that's the point at which the protagonist from the other part, will be stuck inside of his subconscious for all eternity. So his job at the town is to be a dream reader, which is kind of weird. The gatekeeper stabs his eyes with his dagger, which doesn't hurt, but it scars his eyes so that he can't look at the sun or anything bright, but it allows him to read dreams. And how does he read dreams? Well, he goes to the library in the town, where there's a librarian who is assumed to be sort of some weird sort of part of the librarian in the world outside of his mind, outside of the end of the world town. And he doesn't read books, he reads the dreams from skulls. So these unicorn skulls, the skulls of the beasts, the unicorns that exist in this town, like I said, they sort of absorb the minds of the people around them. I don't know the link between them and the shadows. But they absorb the memories, the experiences, whatever, and then when they die, their skulls get preserved, and it has those sort of memories within them. So he has to sit there, and they sort of glow, and he puts his hands on them, and he tries to sort of glean dreams from them, but he can't really make sense of it, because the dreams are scattered across many different of these beasts, and anyways. But he secretly meets up with his shadow, and his shadow's like, make a map of this place. I'm going to make a plan to escape. So that's what he does. He goes around mapping this whole place out, getting to know it, and learning about it. And at the end, his shadow's like, all right, I have a plan to escape. We're going to get out together, and then we will escape back to the real world. And it's presumed that when the protagonist inside this world and the shadow escape, that will prevent the character on the outside from their conscious mind going into their subconscious and sort of melding and being stuck in this town at the end of the world forever. This probably makes no sense to anyone who hasn't read the book. But just before he gets his shadow and goes on this trip, he speaks with the librarian, and she has no mind, but he believes that her mind still exists somewhere, and so he sort of does this massive dream reading where he connects all the skulls in the library, and he sort of finds her mind and is working on somehow collating it and giving it back to her. As he's doing this, or as this is happening, he then goes out and gets his shadow and carries his shadow on his back all the way across town, There's sort of the threat of the gatekeeper coming to get them, but they manage to get to the very end. This sort of pool where if they jump in, they'll get sucked under and they'll escape the town, and it will free them from this weird town. And then the guy in the real world will not lose his mind. But of course, at the 11th hour, the protagonist decides, no, I want to actually stay inside this world. This world where there is no mind, which means there's no love, there's no joy, there's no hatred, there's no sorrow, there's no war. There's none of the ups of life, there's none of the downs of life. It's just a steady, dull existence, but a peaceful one. So he decides he wants to stay there. His reasoning is partly it's because of the girl, but it's not really because of the girl. It's not just that it's a peaceful, quiet existence where he doesn't have to worry about anything and do anything. It's also because he wants to figure out the world and find out more about the world and the town and sort of try and solve it. But I don't know if I believe the main character at that point. Like, curiosity, I think, is part of mind that once his shadow dies, he's not going to have. And I think he's just going to sort of live that quiet life. So yeah, it gets right to the end, and then he decides, no, I'm not going to jump through the whirlpool. And that means that he is going to be stuck inside of his mind, and that means that our main character is going to have his conscious mind get sort of sucked into his subconscious, and it's not good. So it's kind of a not great ending. But I guess it's sort of a metaphor maybe for choosing, instead of risking and choosing an exciting or adventurous or different or unique life, just sort of towing the line and doing the bare minimum and the basics that you need to have a peaceful life, and not risking. No risk, no reward. I don't know. It was a strange one. I think this is the oldest Murakami that I've read. Like I said, it felt different in that it felt more science fiction with this sort of technology that the professor invented and whatnot. But yeah, it was a weird one. I mean, I enjoyed it. If you can get past the Murakami sort of the protagonist and the treatment of women and all that stuff, it is sort of a cozy read, and he has great visuals and great metaphors, great turns of phrases. I think this one had a different translator, because the translation I don't think was as good. Just like some of the slang and the weird accent that the professor had that made him sound like he was like a hillbilly from Texas when he's like a Japanese professor. That was kind of weird. I did like it though. I mean, I like Murakami. It wasn't my favorite one. I don't know if I would say it's my least favorite one either. I would have to really think about what one would be my least favorite. It might actually be my least favorite, but saying that makes it sound like it's a bad thing. I still really did enjoy it, and I'm really glad I read it. It wasn't that long, 400 pages. Very, very unique way it was set up, with the one chapter in the one world, the other chapter in the other world. Then two never meeting. Although, sort of as the reader gains more information, you see the connections between the two. Anyways, that was Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World.